Family, let me tell you something straight from the heart. God has never once been surprised by your situation. What's causing you to panic today didn't sneak up on heaven. The bills, the diagnosis, the broken relationship, the uncertainty about tomorrow, none of it caught God off guard. While you're pacing the floor, God is already positioned on the throne. See, panic happens when we forget who's really in control. We panic when we focus more on the size of the problem than the size of our God. But God is sending a clear message today. Don't panic. This is my department throughout Scripture. Whenever God's people hit a wall, he steps in with divine authority. When Israel stood in front of the Red Sea with Pharaoh behind them, God didn't ask them to figure it out. He told them to stand still and watch him work when the disciples panicked. In the storm, Jesus didn't panic with them. He spoke to the storm and reminded them who was in the boat. Here's the truth. God doesn't need calm circumstances to bring peace. He brings peace into chaos. Your panic won't fix the problem, but your trust releases God's power. Faith is choosing to rest while God is working. And when God is on it, you can stop stressing, stop worrying, and stop trying to control what was never yours to control in the first place. So today, God is saying, take your hands off it. Take your fear off it. Take your anxiety off it. I'm on it. And when God is on it, the outcome is never in doubt. What you are facing right now did not take God by surprise. It may have caught you off guard, shaken your emotions, and interrupted your plans, but it did not interrupt God's awareness or authority. Long before the problem showed up in your life, God already knew it was coming. He saw the moment you would feel overwhelmed, the point where your strength would run low, and the place where fear would try to take over. And yet none of that caused him to panic, because God never reacts, he only rules. One of the reasons people panic is because surprises make us feel out of control. We panic when something enters our life that we did not schedule, did not expect, and did not prepare for. But God does not operate on a limited timeline. He stands outside of time, seeing the beginning, the middle, and the end all at once. What feels sudden to you has already been factored into God's plan. That means a problem is not evidence that God has lost control. It is proof that he is still working within a plan you cannot yet see. When we forget that God already knows, we start assuming that he must be scrambling to figure out what to do. We imagine heaven in emergency mode, as if God is urgently trying to come up with a solution to our crisis. But the truth is, God never has to brainstorm. He never has to gather information. He never has to test options. Every resource, every answer, every outcome is already within his power. The moment the issue arose on earth, the provision was already present in heaven. This is why faith is not about convincing God to act. It is about trusting that God already has a strategy. The delay you are experiencing is not confusion on God's part. It is coordination. He is aligning people, timing, circumstances, and outcomes in ways you cannot yet comprehend. What feels like silence is not absence. It is intentional preparation. God often works behind the scenes long before he reveals himself in the situation. Understanding that God is not surprised changes how you respond to pressure. Instead of reacting emotionally, you can respond spiritually. Instead of rushing into fear-based decisions, you can wait with confidence. Panic pushes you to move before God speaks, but trust allows you to stay positioned until God acts. When you know that God already saw this coming, you can stop trying to outrun the problem and start leaning into his presence. There are moments when God allows you to reach the end of your understanding so that you will depend on his wisdom instead. He permits situations that stretch you beyond your comfort, not to harm you, but to remind you that he has always been your source. When your plans fall apart, it is often because God is protecting you from trusting in something that was never strong enough to hold you. What looks like disruption may actually be divine direction. The enemy wants you to believe that your situation has caught God off guard, because fear grows when you think you are facing the unknown alone. But once you recognize that God already knew and still allowed you to walk into this season, you can trust that there is purpose attached to the pressure. God does not waste pain, confusion, or delay. Everything he allows is filtered through his wisdom and shaped by his love. When you truly believe that God is not surprised, it settles your spirit. You may not understand the process, but you can trust the planner. You may not see the path, but you can rely on the guide. And even when the outcome is unclear, you can rest in the assurance that the one who holds the future is already there, waiting for you. Panic does not begin with the problem itself. It begins with a shift in focus. The moment your attention moves away from who God is and settles solely on what you are facing, fear starts to grow. Problems have a way of demanding your attention. They speak loudly, show up unexpectedly, and pressure you to respond immediately. When that pressure dominates your vision, God can begin to feel distant, not because he has moved, but because your focus has. When authority is forgotten, anxiety takes over. You start measuring the situation by your own strength, resources, and understanding. The question quietly shifts from what can God do to what am I going to do? That shift may seem small, but it is dangerous. It places the weight of the situation on human shoulders instead of divine authority. Nick thrives wherever God's rule is minimized, and peace disappears when his power is no longer central in our thinking. Focusing on the problem alone will always distort reality. Problems look bigger when God looks smaller. Circumstances appear permanent when God's sovereignty is ignored. You start believing that what you see is all there is, and that belief fuels fear. But authority belongs to God, not to circumstances. No situation has the final say. No diagnosis, no loss, no delay, and no opposition outranks the authority of God. When you forget that, panic feels justified, even logical. The mind naturally gravitates toward what it perceives as the greatest power in the room. If the problem appears powerful and God feels distant, fear becomes the default response. That is why panic often shows up when prayer fades, when scripture is neglected, and when worship is replaced with worry. Without consistent reminders of who God is, a soul begins to operate as if God is no longer active. Eli ruling. And when God's authority fades from view, chaos rushes in to fill the gap. Restoring focus is not about denying the reality of the problem. It is about reestablishing the reality of God's reign. Faith does not pretend the storm is not real. It remembers who controls the wind. When God's authority is brought back into focus, panic loses its grip. The situation may still be challenging, but it no longer feels overwhelming. Why? Because authority changes interpretation. The same circumstance looks different when viewed through the lens of God's power. Panic pushes people toward control. It convinces you that if you do not act immediately, everything will fall apart. That urgency often leads to decisions rooted in fear rather than wisdom. You overthink, overreact, and sometimes overstep. But when God's authority is remembered, patience returns. You can pause, you can listen, you can wait. Confidence grows not because the problem has changed, but because your perspective has. Fear also exaggerates the consequences of failure. It whispers that one wrong move will ruin everything. But remembering God's authority reminds you that your life is not hanging by a thread. It is held by his hand. Even your mistakes are not beyond his ability to redeem. Panic assumes that everything depends on you. Faith rests in the truth that everything ultimately depends on God. The enemy's strategy has always been to distract from God's authority. If he cannot remove God from your life, he will attempt to minimize him in your thinking. He magnifies the threat, amplifies the noise, and crowds your mind with what-if scenarios. Over time, fear becomes louder than faith. But the moment God's authority is intentionally acknowledged through prayer, reflection, and trust, the power balance shifts. Peace returns not because the threat disappears, but because God is placed back where he belongs. When authority is restored to its rightful place, panic no longer controls your response. You begin to operate from confidence instead of chaos. You understand that while the problem may be real, it is not ultimate. God remains sovereign, present, and fully capable. And when his authority is central again, peace becomes possible, even in the middle of uncertainty. Standing still does not come naturally when pressure is high. Everything within you wants to move, fix, explain, or escape. Waiting feels risky because it appears passive, as though nothing is being done. But in the economy of faith, standing still is not inactivity. It is alignment. It is choosing to position yourself where God can work rather than rushing ahead and interfering with what he is already doing. Faith is often misunderstood as constant motion. But scripture repeatedly shows that some of God's greatest works happen when his people stop striving. Standing still requires trust because it forces you to acknowledge your limitations. It is an admission that you do not have the strength, wisdom, or control to resolve the situation on your own. That admission is not weakness, it is surrender. And surrender is the doorway through which God's power is released. When people refuse to stand still, they usually act out of fear. Fear creates urgency, and urgency demands immediate action. But God is not intimidated by time. He does not rush, and he is never late. Standing still places you in rhythm with God's timing rather than your own anxiety. It allows you to move when he moves instead of reacting to every emotional impulse. Waiting, in this sense, is not about doing nothing. It is about resisting the temptation to act without direction. Standing still also protects you from making decisions that feel productive but are spiritually costly. In moments of stress, it is easy to mistake motion for progress. You may change directions, cut corners, or compromise values just to feel relief. But faith chooses obedience over relief. Standing still creates space for God's instruction, clarity, and peace to emerge. It gives him room to reveal what cannot be discovered through hurried effort. There is a deep internal battle that happens when you stand still. Your thoughts race, your emotions fluctuate, and doubts try to dominate. But this is where trust is strengthened. Standing still forces you to anchor your confidence in God rather than in outcomes. You begin to believe that even if nothing changes immediately, God is still active. This kind of faith shifts the focus from what you can see to who God is. God often works in ways that are invisible at first. While you are standing still, he is rearranging circumstances, softening hearts, closing certain doors, and opening others. He is working in areas you cannot reach and addressing issues you may not even be aware of. If you move too quickly, you may step outside of what God is orchestrating. Standing still keeps you in position for his intervention. Trusting God enough to stand still also reshapes your character. It teaches patience. See in a culture addicted to instant results. It builds endurance in seasons where progress feels slow. It cultivates humility by reminding you that God is the ultimate source of deliverance. Over time, standing still changes not only your situation, but your spiritual maturity. You begin to rely less on your own understanding and more on God's guidance. Standing still does not mean you stop praying, believing, or preparing. It means you stop panicking, forcing outcomes, and trying to control what belongs to God. It is a deliberate decision to rest internally while remaining attentive spiritually. In that posture, peace grows. Fear loses momentum. Confidence develops. Not because you suddenly understand everything, but because you trust the one who does. When God finally moves, his action is unmistakable. What you could not accomplish through effort, he completes through power. What seemed impossible becomes undeniable. Standing still allows God to receive the glory because it becomes clear that the outcome was not the result of human striving, but divine intervention. And once you experience that, waiting no longer feels like wasted time. It becomes a sacred space where faith is refined and God's work is revealed. Many people believe peace is something that comes after everything settles down. They assume calm will arrive once the problem is solved, the storm passes, or the situation improves. But God does not wait for chaos to end before he brings peace. He brings peace into the middle of it. His peace is not dependent on external conditions. It is rooted in his presence. That is why it is possible to be surrounded by uncertainty and still experience stability within. Chaos has a way of convincing you that peace is impossible right now. It tells you that once you fix this issue, handle that conflict, or get past this season, then you can rest. But God's peace does not operate on an after schedule. It operates on a with you promise. Peace is not the absence of trouble. It is the assurance that God is present and active while trouble exists. When God brings peace into chaos, he does not always remove the storm immediately. Sometimes the wind still blows, the pressure remains, and the questions linger. What changes is not the environment, but the internal condition of your soul. God stabilizes you before he stabilizes the situation. He anchors your heart so that circumstances no longer control your emotional state. That kind of peace cannot be manufactured by logic or willpower. It is the result of trusting God's nearness and authority. This peace allows you to function without falling apart. It keeps fear from hijacking your decisions and emotions. You are able to think clearly, respond wisely, and remain grounded even when everything around you feels unstable. Chaos loses its power to dominate when peace takes residence within. That does not mean you ignore reality. It means reality no longer defines your hope. God's peace also serves as a reminder of who is truly in control. Chaos makes life feel random and unmanageable, but peace restores order internally, even when things externally remain unresolved. It reassures you that God is not absent, distracted, or overwhelmed. His presence becomes the constant in an unpredictable environment. You begin to understand that even if the situation takes time to change, you are not facing it alone. When peace enters chaos, it changes how you wait. Waiting without peace feels like punishment. Waiting with peace becomes purposeful. You stop counting the minutes and start trusting the process. Peace allows you to endure delays without despair. It gives you the strength to remain faithful without knowing how or when the resolution will come. That endurance is not natural. It is sustained by God's presence. This kind of peace also protects your heart from becoming hardened or bitter. Chaos has the potential to shape your character negatively if left unchecked. Anxiety can turn into anger. Fear can turn into control. But peace interrupts that process. It softens your heart, keeping you open to God's guidance and sensitive to his voice. It prevents a situation from defining who you become in the process. God's peace does not deny pain, but it prevents pain from becoming your master. You can still feel disappointment, grief, or concern while remaining anchored in peace. That balance is possible because peace is not emotional numbness. It is spiritual confidence. It is the quiet assurance that God is working even when you cannot trace his hand. When peace is present, worship becomes possible in the middle of difficulty. Gratitude finds space to grow even in hard seasons. Hope remains alive because it is rooted in God's character, not in circumstances. Chaos may continue to swirl, but it no longer dictates your inner life. Peace establishes boundaries that chaos cannot cross. Over time, you begin to recognize that God's peace is fragile. It does not shatter under pressure or disappear when challenges persist. It remains steady, reliable, and sustaining. That peace becomes evidence that God is actively involved, holding you steady while he works things out in ways you may not yet see. When God is on it, the outcome is never hanging in the balance, even when it feels that way to you. Uncertainty may surround the process, but uncertainty never surrounds God. He does not guess, hope, or assume. He knows. And because he knows, the end is not fragile, negotiable, or dependent on perfect human performance. The security of the outcome rests not in how well you manage the situation, but in who has ultimate authority over it. One of the main sources of anxiety is the fear that things could fall apart if one more thing goes wrong. You worry about making the wrong decision, missing the right moment, or not doing enough. That fear grows when you believe the outcome is resting on your shoulders. But when God is truly on, the pressure to control every detail begins to lift. You realize that while your obedience matters, the success of the outcome does not depend on your perfection. God is capable of accomplishing his purposes even through human weakness. This truth does not encourage carelessness. It encourages confidence. Knowing that God secures the outcome allows you to walk forward without being paralyzed by fear. You can make decisions with wisdom instead of panic. You can move forward without obsessing over worst-case scenarios. When God is on it, even setbacks lose their power to define the end. What looks like delay, loss, or failure may actually be a redirection that still leads to his intended result. People often confuse uncertainty about the process with uncertainty about the outcome. The path may twist, slow down, or look nothing like what you expected, but that does not mean the destination has changed.
God does not adjust his plans every time circumstances shift. He remains steady.
How life feels unstable. When he is involved, nothing is wasted. Not confusion, not detours, not even mistakes. He weaves all of it into a greater purpose that stands firm. When the outcome is secure, fear loses its authority. Fear thrives on the belief that everything could collapse at any moment. But confidence grows when you trust that God is guarding the end result. You may not know how he will do it or when he will move, but you know he will be faithful. That assurance creates peace even while questions remain unanswered. Trusting that God is on it also changes how you interpret resistance. Opposition no longer feels like proof that things are failing. Instead, it becomes confirmation that something meaningful is in motion. Challenges do not indicate that God has stepped away. Often, they appear precisely because he is at work. When the outcome is secure, resistance becomes temporary rather than threatening. This perspective also frees you from comparing your journey to others. When you believe God is handling your outcome, you stop measuring progress by someone else's timeline. You understand that God works uniquely in every life. What he is building in you may require a different pace, different struggles, and different lessons. The outcome he has secured for you is not diminished by how long it takes to arrive. Knowing that the outcome is secure encourages perseverance. You keep going even when motivation fades because your hope is not tied to immediate results. You remain faithful in small things because you trust that God is using them to shape the final picture. When discouragement whispers that your efforts are pointless, confidence reminds you that God is still working behind the scenes. This security also deepens humility. You begin to recognize that when success comes, it will not be something you can fully take credit for. The outcome will point back to God's faithfulness, not human strength. That awareness keeps pride in check and gratitude alive. You learn to celebrate progress without idolizing achievement. When God is on it, you can rest without becoming passive. You stay engaged without being consumed. You remain hopeful without demanding immediate proof. The outcome may still be unfolding, but it is not in jeopardy. God is steady, intentional, and fully committed to finishing what he started. And that truth allows you to walk forward with quiet confidence, knowing that the end is not uncertain. It is secure in his hands. There comes a moment when God not only works on the situation, but works on you while the situation remains unresolved. This is often the part people overlook. We want deliverance without development, answers without transformation, relief without refinement. But God is intentional with timing because he is just as committed to shaping your character as he is to changing your circumstances. What you are walking through is not only something God is handling for you, it is something he is using to grow you. Pressure has a way of exposing what is really sustaining your faith. When everything is comfortable, it is easy to say you trust God. But when control is removed, options are limited, and outcomes are unclear, trust is tested. God allows these seasons not to weaken your faith, but to deepen it. He is teaching you how to rely on him in ways you never had to before. The waiting, the uncertainty, and the tension all become tools in his hands. While you are focused on what God will do, he is also focused on who you are becoming. Patience is being formed. Humility is being strengthened. Discernment is being sharpened. Faith is being purified. These qualities cannot be developed in ease. They are forged in pressure. God uses He delayed to prepare you for what is ahead so that when the door opens, you are ready to walk through it wisely. Many people pray for change, but God often starts with alignment. He aligns your heart, your motives, and your priorities with his will. If he moves too quickly, you might step into the blessing unprepared and mishandle what he intended to use for good. So he takes time, not because he is slow, but because he is thorough. What feels like waiting is often God strengthening the foundation beneath you. This inner work also changes how you see God. You begin to know him not just as a deliverer, but as a sustainer. You learn that even before the breakthrough comes, God is enough. That realization is powerful because it breaks the idea that peace, joy, or confidence must be postponed until circumstances improve. You start to experience stability that is not dependent on outcomes. As God works on you, your reactions begin to change. You become less frantic and more prayerful, less reactive and more reflective, less driven by fear and more guided by trust. These shifts may seem subtle, but they are significant. They are evidence that God's work is taking root internally. The situation may look the same on the outside, but something new is happening within. This process also teaches you obedience without guarantees. You continue to do what is right even when results are not immediate. You remain faithful even when recognition is absent. That kind of obedience builds spiritual endurance. It strengthens your ability to follow God, not just when the path is clear, but when the way forward requires faith rather than sight. God's work in you also prepares you to steward what comes next. Whatever He is bringing into your life, whether opportunity, responsibility, influence, or blessing, will require maturity to sustain it. The season you are in now is shaping that maturity. What you are learning in private will support what God does in public. The process is part of provision. Sometimes you do not realize how much you have grown until you look back and notice how differently you handle things that once overwhelmed you. The same circumstances that once caused panic now lead you to prayer. The same uncertainty that once produced fear now produces trust. That change did not happen by accident. It happened because God was at work in you while He was working on it. In the end, you come to understand that God's involvement is never limited to fixing problems. He is always forming people. And when He finishes what He is doing in you, you will be strong enough, wise enough, and grounded enough to step into what He has already secured for you.